Yes, and we're back. Welcome, everybody. We're here for our second talk with a very special guest who I'd like to give a warm welcome. Hidde de Vries, all the way from. This is a bridge. Where are you from, Hidde? Where are you broadcasting from?
Rotterdam, the Netherlands. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I might have some technical difficulties because I didn't hear Hidde. Rotterdam, I hear. Cool, cool, cool. Maybe to all the people at home, it's cool if you guys could type in the chat where you're watching from. But until we go there, let me give a quick introduction about Hidde. Hidde is here with us as a freelance front-end developer and an accessibility expert. Normally, I would say a self-proclaimed accessibility expert, but Hidde has something under his belt. That is that he worked for the W3C, I don't even know how you call it, organization. What is it? And that's a really cool thing, I guess, because he can tell us everything about it. And that's exactly what his talk is about. It's about accelerating accessibility in a component-based world. And a fun hook, it seems like Hidde has worked with Capgemini 10 years ago with us at ABN AMRO. So it's sort of a warm relation, I could say. Either way, Hidde, the stage is yours. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Gail. It's really cool for me to be here. Really enjoyed Sven's talk earlier, and I learned a lot about web workers. I'm definitely going to be checking out those links that he shared in this last slide. There's a lot of information out there that I'm gonna learn about. I'm going to be teaching you today about web accessibility. And yes, Gabriel's right. I've done a lot of accessibility work in the last years. I worked as an accessibility consultant and also front-end developer, which is my background. And most recently, I have worked at the World Wide Web Consortium. That's an organization that makes web standards. So you might know this organization from HTML, CSS, and also a lot of accessibility standards. Yeah, that's that. I also have a blog, by the way. It's on hidde.blog. You can like and subscribe if that's your kind of thing. You can use RSS to read this content, or subscribe on Twitter and figure out that way. I write a lot about like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, accessibility, all those sorts of things. So without further ado, let's have a look at what accessibility actually is. Because I can imagine many of you will have come across it when you work for clients. But as I do a lot of accessibility audits, I also see that there are a lot of websites where not all of the accessibility is as it is supposed to be. And a lot of my work is around, trying to make sure that people understand how web accessibility works and kind of what the mechanisms are that you're working with. So if I had to give a very short definition, I would say that accessibility is to ensure that people with disabilities can use your website. That's what it's all about. So accessibility is about people with disabilities. It is about that they can use your website, that they can purchase products on your website. If you have a web shop or you're in e-commerce and you're selling stuff on your site, that people with disabilities can actually go and do that. They can complete all of the steps that are on your site, or that they can use your service. Maybe you're a government agency and you're allowing people to kind of apply for a passport or a driving license or something like that. It is ensuring that people with disabilities are able to do that without having to go and ask someone else to come and help them. A lot of people in the disability community that I've spoken to, it's really upsetting and annoying for people if a website isn't accessible, because it means they need to ask for help. And the web is this amazing platform where they can do so much just by themselves. And that makes a lot of sense. Now you might wonder by now, who are people with disabilities? Are there many? And the answer is yes, there are a lot of people with disabilities in the world. 1 in 5 actually, 1 in 5 people on this planet have a disability or are disabled by their environment in some way or another. Maybe you have a disability yourself if you're watching this. maybe a relative, a neighbor, a friend who does. Many of us have disabilities, and some of them can be visible, others can be hidden. It includes people who are blind, who have vision impairments, people who are hard of hearing, maybe they're deaf, people with physical disabilities, like, someone might be in a wheelchair, or, some people, they don't have a hand, or like they only have one hand or something like that, and they're unable to use a mouse for that reason. Like, there's a lot of different disabilities. Sometimes they overlap too. And there's people with cognitive disabilities too, like brain damage and things like that. Lots of different different aspects to that. Sometimes people are disabled from birth. It can also be that they are disabled from a disease, or sometimes there's an accident that caused something. It can be developed with age. If you have parents that are older, or grandparents, you might know that they turn on their TV and it will be a bit louder, or they might be using subtitles. There's a lot of people that require accessibility to exist. Now, these statistics are a little bit tricky because different countries and health organizations, they have different ways of defining accessibility, different ways of measuring. So I've taken this number from the WHO, which is the World Health Organization. They have published a report on disability, and one chapter is about demographics, and it's all about how big is this group, and comparing all these different research papers about this. So the number it can be 1 in 5. Some people say 1 in 4, but that it is a really big group, and that's also something that's shown by the research of this consultancy in the Netherlands called Q42. They built a lot of apps for their clients, and they have built some prominent Dutch apps in the Dutch App Store. And they were able to measure some stuff in their app usage. And they figured out that 43% of their users, and this is over a population of 1 million users, or sessions, I have to double check, but 43% of people they found are using accessibility settings. That's huge. That's a lot of people. They are likely using your websites too. And you've got to make sure that they're accessible so that people can access that stuff. I mentioned it before. People with disabilities, they face a lot of barriers on the web. A lot of the web is great because it is accessible by default. But still, it is the case that even for simple tasks like I want to transfer some money, or see my balance, or I want to make a vaccine appointment, or maybe a testing appointment to participate in society, we've got to smash those barriers. It's not okay that people might be left out of those sorts of things. So it's important that this works, and it's also good for business, as many businesses do around the world. They take accessibility into account for their business, for business reasons. Apple, for instance, one of the richest companies in the world, making lots of profit, and they sometimes give bonuses to their executives. And one of the things that they base their bonus policy on is core values, and one of those core values is accessibility. So if an executive has performed well in accessibility, they will get more bonus. It is integrated into the company like that, and you can see Apple produce a lot of accessibility focused products, like iPhones and Mac OS all come with built-in screen readers and voice control, and lots of different features that people with disabilities can use. I'm using Apple as an example because there was this article news about the executive pay, but you can see this in a lot of big tech companies like Microsoft and Google, and many of them are working on that their stuff is accessible because they feel that makes sense. Now, how can you get accessibility done? Like, how do you integrate it into your work? What sort of things do you need to do? There's a couple of different routes. I always mention them together. So one is accessibility standards. I won't talk too much about them in detail today. but accessibility standards, they prescribe kind of what you need to do to be accessible, and they provide a way for governments to measure web accessibility. There's also best practices, so code examples and ways that people have found accessibility works. And then there's also user testing that you'll likely need to do. And you can include people with disabilities in your user testing. So, invite someone who has low vision, or invite someone who uses their computer with voice control, or someone who uses a screen reader. And you'll see how well your interface works and how they use it. All right, so I promised to talk about components. So let's do that. When I just started out, and this was a little before I was working with Capgemini at ABN AMRO, which I think that's over 10 years ago, I would be tasked to build web pages based on Photoshop files. And a designer would cut them out kind of per page. Sometimes I would even be paid per page. Like they would say, oh, we've got 10 pages and this is the rate that we're gonna agree on. And you would be building an interface page by page. And sometimes in CSS, of course, you would think about, we can componentize some of this stuff. And if we've got a header on every page, we can use the same styles for that, or like even buttons and stuff like that. But over recent years, components have really changed the way that we design and develop and create for the web. Thanks to the work by people like Alex Matova, who wrote the Design Systems book, Brett Frost, who wrote Atomic Design. All of these people have made us realize, components are here to stay, and a lot of people on our teams are working in components, not just developers, but also designers and sometimes even content people. Now, in components, reusability is key. So with components, we can also reuse accessibility, and I think that's a really powerful thing. But with this power comes responsibility as well, because if we can reuse, that means we could reuse accessible patterns, but at the same time, we could also repeat inaccessible patterns. It's whether we've done the effort and made sure that our patterns are accessible, right? So if we don't do the accessibility work, we risk that our inaccessibility gets propagated. If we do the accessibility work, we get accessibility for free in lots of places because we are repeating that accessibility. So that's quite nice. That's I think really really good to have. Now, when it comes to accessibility, the good news is that you can pick any framework. It doesn't really matter whether you do your coding in React or Vue or 11t, which I personally really like. Whether you do it in FrontPage or Astro, it doesn't really matter. It is the markup that matters. The markup is really important, and I'm talking about HTML here. So if someone comes to your website and they enter your URL, they'll be typing that in, press enter, and the server is going to respond with your markup. It's going to send a blob of markup, and then the browser is going to turn that into a DOM tree. We've seen that in our browsers. Of course, most developers watching this will know what that is. It's not trivial, for sure. Like, it's quite hard to construct a DOM tree because when you make a mistake in your markup, forget to close a tag, or maybe you've opened the H1 and then closed the H2. That sort of stuff happens, and the browser is going to automatically take care of that for you. If you want to know more about that, there is a great book by Simon Peters called The Idiosyncrasies of the HTML Parser. It goes into a lot of detail about these sorts of parsing issues. It's really hard to make a DOM tree, but the browsers do it all the time in real time for you. So it's a live representation of what you've sent. Like, that markup was the original kind of thing that caused this DOM to happen, and then you have scripts that interact with it and manipulate it and do all sorts of things with it. So the DOM tree is the live representation of that page in HTML. Now, what not everyone knows is that there is a second tree, which is the accessibility tree. And an accessibility tree contains all of your accessibility information. So that is stuff like what we see here, is that a link or a button? What we see there, is it expanded or is it collapsed? That sort of information, whether a link says click here, or it says here's more information about our products and you can click on products. It has all that information. So names, roles, and states are in that tree. And the reason that this exists is assistive technologies. But people with disabilities sometimes use tools in order to access the web in a way that works for them. So not just the web, the computer in general. So people who are blind, they may be using a screen reader. Not all blind people do that. Some have other methods, but some blind people use screen readers and they read out everything that happens on the screen to the user. They provide an interface to that. And there are other devices like you can have voice control that you talk to a computer and then tell your computer what you want to see. Now, these assistive technologies, they need to know in order to provide that interface, they need to know what happens on the screen. They need to understand, on Windows, you've got this start menu, you've got this place where you can look at files and terminals and all of this stuff. They need to know what's going on your screen, and they are told this information by so-called platform APIs. So they inform assistive tech about what happens on the user screen so that it can be read out or be converted into Braille in real time or all that sort of thing. They also know what the browser is. They might know what your favorites menu is in browser or your toolbar, what sort of tabs you have. But what they don't know is when someone enters your website and goes to your website, they don't know what your website looks like because that might be the first time that they access your website. So that's where the accessibility trait comes in. Because it has a lot of representation, it is going to give all of that information to the platform APIs and ultimately to the accessible technologies, the assistive tech. Now, as I mentioned before, this information comes from the DOM tree, which comes from your markup. So this is why I like to claim it is the markup that matters. HTML is really important, and I urge everyone, if you do job interviews with front-end developers, yes, do ask them about end-to-end testing and check out their React knowledge, but also make sure that they actually understand HTML really well. And HTML is hard. If you look at the HTML specification, you'll find so many secrets that many developers aren't even aware of. There's a lot of information there. It's all quite important for web accessibility. So if you have a bunch of components, what can you do to find out that they are accessible? How can you ensure? So what I've done is, because I've done a lot of auditing, I've seen a lot of websites that have accessibility problems and have written them down in reports. And this is kind of the best of. This is the kind of stuff that I see on a lot of websites. So if you are able to get these things in your components, you will pass a lot of my audits, right? So I'll have to look more and I can focus on the harder problems because many of these are not as hard as they may seem. So let's get started. An accessible component works without a mouse. This is really important for people who are blind because, using a mouse, this might sound too simple, but using a mouse requires eye-hand coordination, which if you're blind, you are not able to do that often. So, use a keyboard. Maybe people with low vision, they might have trouble kind of tracking a cursor around the screen. People with hand tremors, they might find it hard to use a mouse and for that reason use a keyboard. So there's a lot of different people that use keyboards. So you want to make sure that everything works with a keyboard. Maybe if you have a sprint demo your stuff with just that keyboard. A way to test if you're doing it right is to check if something is clickable, if you can interact with it. It should also be tabbable, so you should be able to get there with just your tab key. That is the case for links and buttons and any kind of other control that you have on your page. Then another thing to look for is if the active control is highlighted. So you're looking at part of my website here and you cannot see my mouse, but you can see because I'm using my keyboard which link I'm currently at. You can see that because there's a rectangle drawn around that. So many people find these rectangles ugly, but in situations like the presentation, you're unable to see my mouse, so it's the only way that you can know which link I'm currently at, and if I press enter, which one I'm going to go to. I might compare it to a TV where you don't have a mouse either. You need some kind of indication of what element you're currently looking at. And then another thing to test for is, does the order make sense? So you want to have a logical, usable source order as Wcag says. So if you're tabbing, make sure that you're not going from the header to the footer and back to the header and then to the content and back to the footer and don't want to go all over the place, which is the case sometimes, depending on what your DOM order looks like. And I see some of you maybe think now, yes, I did put that modal overlay at the bottom of my DOM order, so maybe that does have a weird order. So look at that. Try your interface with just a tab key. Then an accessible component also has sufficient contrast. Now this is really important for people with low vision or color blindness, because they find it difficult to read text with low contrast. And it's fairly easy to test in the sense that what you can do is you can use an automated contrast checker. There are websites like contrastratio.com, or you can use the stuff that's built into Firefox and Chrome and Edge. They all come with contrast checkers, and they will tell you whether you have enough contrast. And this is important to check. The exact formula is not perfect. It's sometimes a bit weird, but it doesn't really matter. You just want to have the right number, and it works for the majority of cases. If you want to have more detailed information about how well your colors work and how the contrast works, you can also use whocanuse.com. It's a bit like Can I Use, but for color combinations, and it's going to tell you about what sort of combinations work, and this can also be helpful to talk to shareholders or maybe talk to other people in the team to discuss colors. Because as a front-end developer, it's often your job to implement the colors. So if there is a color contrast issue, you might be the first one to encounter it if the developer or the designer may have missed it. It is important. Sometimes it's a bit of a fight in a big organization, but realize that a company like ING, the bank, they have this bright orange color on a white background with their logo. Everything is orange. They change their orange to meet these contrast requirements, and if they can do it, your client can as well. This is just a matter of conversation and making sure that everyone understands what this is all about. Then an accessible component also names all controls. Every control on the web has a name, and you can control it basically. And this is important, as the blind user Holly Chu put on her blog. Unlabeled links make it a lot harder for me to navigate the website easily, quickly, and independently. So she struggles with websites that don't name their links. And this is the case also for people with physical disabilities who might be using voice control. People are blind and use screen readers, they might have the same problem. Let me give you an example. So let's say you're building a social network, and there's a box that you can type your message in. It's got a send button in the right bottom corner. And if you're building this button, maybe you'll come up with a button element that's probably the right element for that. And the accessibility tree is going to show up with a row of button. That's the default you get with the button element. So that's great, that looks good. But if you look more closely, it also says accessible name equals null, or maybe empty string in some implementations. That's not ideal. It has no name. And this is a big problem because it means that when you end up with a screen reader, you don't know what the button is for. It's just going to say here's a button, and you don't know if it's going to cancel the message, if it's maybe going to open the photo upload thing, or whatever. You don't know what it's going to do. So what you want to do is put some text inside of that, and then that's going to be the accessible name. So if I put the word send in there, it's going to have an accessible name of send. That's fairly straightforward. That's the most common way to add a name to a control. Put text inside of it. Now sometimes you might want to put an image in there, like an image of an aeroplane, an icon for sending stuff away somewhere, like your message flies away. If you have an alt attribute, which you should have on an image, like airplane, then that's going to be part of the accessible name. So the accessible name will now be send aeroplane. If you remove the text, then the name will be just aeroplane. And this is really common, like with the logo of your website. It's quite common that it will link to the homepage, but that there's no actual text. So then often the alt text of the image becomes the name. So you want to make sure that the name makes sense and that it correctly describes what that button is going to do or what that link is going to do. So in this case, aeroplane is not helpful, and you want something like send it. You can put that in the alternative text, or you can put it in an area label attribute, which will name that element. Or you can use area label by and refer to another element on the page. So that refers to another element that has an ID of H. And So that's underneath the span with IDH, and then it's going to take that name from there. So basically you want to ensure that all of the components in your interface have useful names for all of the buttons and links. There is a specification at the W3C that exactly describes what order is, like how it's picked. You'll find things like if you put text there before and after in CSS or alt text, it's only going to take that into account. Or you can use a real label and label by to override that. So that's the order of things. Basically, if you want to test this, you want to look at, is there a name? What is it? And then secondly, is that name meaningful? So does it really help the user understand what the controls are going to do? You don't want to describe what it looks like, so not aeroplane, but you want to say what it does, like send. And you want to keep it short as well. Over to the next one. An accessible component also allows for zoom. People with low vision find this important, and they need this. So people with low vision, they might be zooming in a lot of the time, like zooming into a 400% or something like that. And what often happens in interfaces is that text starts to overlap. So here I have a previous image and a next image button, but because they're lying on top of each other, I can't make sense of the interface. And this is a simplified example. You may know of examples like this on your websites. And yeah, it just breaks the interface for people with low vision. And the way to fix it is basically responsive design. Because if you zoom in and it shows that mobile view, that's probably what you're looking for. Now, the last thing that an accessible component needs to do is to convey any state to assistive technologies. Because some users are using screen readers or other assistive technologies, and they need to know what is happening in the interface. So when I talk about state in terms of accessibility, it's stuff like, is this disabled or expanded? Is it hidden? Is it invalid? All that sort of information. So with ARIA attributes, you're able to set that state there. Now, lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the future, or what might be the future of some of this, and that's the accessibility object model. It's an interesting proposal that some folks are working on from the major browsers, and what they want to do is give you access to accessibility information through APIs, and maybe allow you to set that information through those APIs as well. So get and set. AOM is supposed to fill some gaps in ARIA and have an API that lets you provide your own accessibility. And it also lets you test from JavaScript, which is, I think, quite exciting. So one thing you can do is set semantics without markup. That's helpful when you're writing custom components, for instance, because rather than using a role attribute in your element, you can do element.role and use IDL properties to set your information directly. This avoids what they call sprouting. So if you create a web component that requires a disabled and a role attribute, now the user of that component no longer needs to add those attributes because you can add them through JavaScript. So you can set them without setting the attributes. AOM also looks at relationships without ID refs. So sometimes you have a relationship like between an ID and a for attribute, or a lot of other ARIA attributes. They have some kind of relationship where you need to point at some other element on the page. All of these, they currently require elements to have IDs, and with this it becomes a bit easier to make relationships, and that's nice if you have web components and you need to go over the boundaries of Shadow DOM. Now, some other things that AOM looks at is events from assistive tech, so that you can actually find out what assistive tech is trying to do and act on that. And something that is looked at is some way to have non-DOM nodes in the accessibility tree. So I said before, accessibility tree is based off the DOM, but some people are building websites that don't use DOM, like Google Docs is doing that. They build everything on Canvas. If I remember right, that's their latest implementation. And that means that everything that's in that canvas is not in the accessibility tree. So this would allow them to somehow still add accessibility information there. This is still a bit in flux because there are lots of privacy concerns around this, and some of it might be fixed through some ARIA properties instead. Now, the last thing that AO might bring, and that I think is interesting for all of us, is that you might be able to read the accessibility tree in JavaScript. So you can figure out whether something is expanded according to area, or something is disabled, or something is a button. And you cannot just look at the attribute in the DOM, but you can actually look at what the accessibility tree has on that element. And that's really helpful. Then you can use that in your unit tests. Now, all of this is to come. AOM is still in flux and it's still being worked on, but I thought it would be interesting to give you a little bit of a peek in what the future might bring. And some of this stuff is actually also already in the browser. So yeah, have a look at that proposal. All right, so with that in mind, I want to go to the summary and tell you what the main takeaways are of today's talk. They are that we've got to build accessible components. I hope that makes sense. Like, you will have lots of people that need accessible components, and if your components aren't accessible, they might come to your competitor's website where they are able to use it. This is actually stuff. I do hear people with disabilities say, like a blind friend of mine recently switched to another supermarket because her online supermarket had updated the interface and it was no longer usable. So we've got to do this. We've got to build accessible components. Markup matters. HTML is really important in this respect. If you use standards, best practices, and user tests, you can combine those, you will have a perfect accessibility strategy. And lastly, consider keyboard, contrast, names, zoom states, and also user preferences. I didn't get to talking about user preferences today, but these slides will be online. I believe they will be shared in the chat, and otherwise you can find them on my website. They are online already, and you can find a bit about user preferences there as well. Now, with that, I want to thank you very much for listening today, and I think we're going over to some live Q&A now.
That's correct. Yes, I'm back. First of all, I'd like to thank you as well, instead of thanking the audience. I think we have lots of cool insights from your presentation. But like you said, there's also some questions coming out of that. And the first one actually ties in with what you said with user preferences, I guess. Sophie, who asked us, is it possible to create a WCAG compliant application that is still unusable? And if so, how do you decide when an application is not only accessible, but also usable?
That's a great question. One example I can give, and that I know, is that, and this diverges away a little bit from the question, but there is this thing you can use, Google Lighthouse, where you can measure lots of metrics, including accessibility. And I know there's folks working on websites that pass the Lighthouse test and are still super inaccessible. So yes, that exists. I think you should be able to create a WCAG compliant website somehow by reading the specifications really well and kind of working around them. Generally, they are a really good baseline and they cover a lot of bases. So I think something you might be able to do is like set the opacity of your whole website to 0.1 and do that sort of thing. But I think you probably end up, missing some contrast stuff there. So yeah, it will be quite tricky. Generally, accessibility and usability go hand in hand, and I see usability really as an extension of WCAG. WCAG can be quite technical. It is based on user requirements, and a lot of people with disabilities are in the WCAG committees, so they make that standard. But still, it helps a lot to also be doing user testing because, sometimes something can be technically correct. Like you could have tabs interface that is perfect according to standard, but some users might still struggle to use it because they don't know the key combinations or that sort of thing. So yeah, that definitely exists.
Yeah, clear. Thank you. I think another question beautifully ties in with what you said with Google Lighthouse, because there's a question from the audience asking if there's an automation tool which automatically tests this, for instance, in your build pipeline or something similar.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a group of people who work on automated testing rule interpretations of WCAG. So WCAG has 50 guidelines that you want to check against. And this group tries to see if we can rewrite all of those as testing rules. And what they find is, of course, you cannot test all of them. There's a small number that you can test automatically. It's estimated between 10 and 40%, depending on how you define stuff and whether you are selling an automated testing tool or not. Like this, the people who build these tools are a bit more optimistic than I am personally. But you can use automated tests and put them in your pipelines. I do recommend that. It is very helpful, but it only finds like 20% of your issues. And that's great to have, because that means you can start to worry about the other 80%, and at least you won't have those issues. And there's a lot of things that I find in audits that automated tests could have caught out in the pipeline. And a nice aspect to that is that you can fix problems before they actually go live. And that's great for your end users as well.
Yeah, clear. Then one question, and I know this because I was talking with Sven behind the scenes. He was really looking forward to this talk because it would talk about components and accessibility. But he had a really particular question about web components and the shadow root. So he wants to ask, are web components using the shadow root, could those also become more accessible? Or
Yes, in the future. So there is lots of work happening around that, because there are some problems, like I mentioned before. If you want to create relationships between things in the light DOM and shadow DOM, you can currently not cross those boundaries and set like connect a label to an input, for instance. And that sort of thing is still not completely solved, but there is some work happening, and I think it is available behind Flex in some browsers. But yeah, that's still really being worked on. There are a couple of those kinds of issues. And I know there are also people who have found workarounds, like put everything in the light DOM and that sort of thing.
okay, clear. I wish I could scream now to see if Sven was happy with this answer or not. He puts 2 thumbs up from
Is he
behind the
still
camera.
around?
2 thumbs up from behind the camera, so I guess he's happy. And then one final question. I honestly know this because I'm working at the police right now. But the question from the audience is if accessibility is required by law.
Yes. This is a great question too. It is required by law if you are a government organization or some organization that does something that is serves a public need. Definitions vary for that. That's a bit complicated, but yes, public organizations, they need to do that since 2018, and before that there were other rules in place as well. But yeah, since 2018, and for businesses there is a new European Accessibility Act coming up, and businesses need to comply with that from 2025. So in a couple of years, and that applies to some very specific sectors, like aviation, public transport. So if you want to buy a ticket, that has to be accessible. A couple of those sorts of things. E-commerce is a big one, banking. So a lot of the things that people need in their daily lives, that's what the European Commission started with. And they said, at least the stuff that people need in their daily lives, they need to be accessible so that people can, do stuff online.
Yeah, clear. Yeah, I think we already mentioned some accessibility standards you would need to apply to, but I guess that's the final question we have from the audience, asking about these accessibility standards. So say we want to start with this, even though it's 2025, you just said, where do we need to look these up?
Yeah, it is definitely a great thing to do, I think, to look at these standards now to prepare for 2025. If you're doing it for the law, because I've also given some examples that, it might make sense to do it anyway, even if you don't have to, because a lot of these things are more expensive. You just need to be in the back of your head, basically, and then they're cheap. If you need to do them later, they're expensive. Having said that, you can look them up. The standard is called WCAG 2.1. That's WCAG 2.1. What you probably want to look for is the quick rev. If you search for quick reference, there is a specific version of the standard that is a bit easier to read. There is also a Dutch translation available if you work with Dutch clients that exist as well. And you're usually looking for AA. So there's 3 levels, A, AA, and AAA. And usually you want to meet AA. And that's also the one that's in most of the laws around this, like in the US and Europe and China. So most of them say, you need to meet AA standard.
Clear. And I think one of those examples from my past is I've worked in some e-commerce spots. And just like you said, even though it's not required by law yet, those could also be customers. So indeed, just service of
Yeah, that's money for them. Like, yeah, 25% of your users, they're not going to give you a 25% increase in profits, but there is definitely something to gain there. Like if you can get a bunch of those customers to buy your products, then yeah, they can make you money
Exactly.
for sure.
Yeah, clear. Again, I'd like to thank you. I hope everybody in the chat can also give Hidde a big applause, virtually maybe. This is the one for me at least. So put those hands together as emojis or something and thank Hidde, because yeah, appreciate it that you gave the talk here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
No worries. Yeah, that concludes, I guess, the front-end talk, both of them actually. So I'd like to thank Sven and Hidde once again for being here, for presenting. And I think we have a small break until Jan from the test stream needs to run back all the way from Studio 2. Yeah, low lives. They need a different studio, of course. But we'll tune back in when they wrap up and we're all back together here in this studio. So please stay tuned and we'll talk to you in a bit to round this evening off. Thank you very much.